If anyone present knows of any impediment why these two should not be joined in matrimony, speak now or forever. Hold your peace." The entire ballroom held its breath. No one moved, not a single breath. "I object!" The orchestra stopped dead. Crystal glasses shattered against marble. Cell phones rose instinctively. 200 millionaire guests turned as one body, eyes wide and mouths agape. The father stood frozen, his smile locked on his face. Samuel Harrison, barely 8 years old, stood in the middle of the aisle, clutching a cell phone in his small, trembling hands. "Dad, if I don't speak now, no one will ever listen to me again." Alexander Harrison took a step backward. His face drained of all color. The silence in the ballroom now hurt. If this story has already touched your heart in this first minute, subscribe to the channel. Here you'll find stories that heal, inspire, and make you believe in human goodness again. 3 hours earlier, the Plaza Hotel had been transformed into a palace. 10-foot floral arrangements, Austrian crystal glasses, chandeliers worth a fortune. Alexander Harrison had invested $3 million in this wedding. At 45, he was the man who had built half the skyscrapers in Manhattan. A widower for 3 years, since an accident took Caroline, his wife, until Victoria Sterling arrived. 32 years old, masters in international relations, event organizer for children's foundations. She seemed perfect. Too perfect. Samuel watched from the front row, dressed in a tuxedo that was too big for him. He was small for his age, with eyes that seemed too large for his face. Since his mother's death, words had become scarce for him. Beside him, Grace Williams maintained a professional smile. At 50, she had been a nanny her entire life. She had cared for Samuel since he was a baby, and after Caroline's death, she had become his only real ally. Grace knew what no one else knew, and for the past 6 months, she had helped Samuel document what no one else had heard. When the priest asked the ritual question, Samuel felt his heart leap from his chest. "I object." The guests turned as one body. Among them were partners, politicians, businessmen, people who could make or break reputations. Victoria was the first to react, her voice sweet as honey. "Oh, my beautiful boy. He's nervous, poor little thing." She addressed the guests with a maternal smile. "Samuel has been so excited about the wedding, right, my love?" But Samuel didn't move. "I'm not nervous, Victoria. And I'm not your boy." A murmur ran through the tables. Alexander sweated under his tuxedo. "Samuel, please. I have something to say before it's too late, Dad. Everyone needs to hear the truth." He pulled out the cell phone. It was an old model Grace had given him for emergencies. On the screen glowed a recording icon. "I have 6 months of recordings. I have proof of what really happens when you're not around." The silence became thick. Victoria took a step toward the boy, but something in his eyes stopped her. Samuel pressed play, and then Victoria's voice filled the ballroom. But it wasn't the sweet voice everyone knew. What secrets had Samuel been keeping during all those months? What had he recorded that was so terrible it was worth ruining the most exclusive wedding of the year? "You know what, Samuel? Your mom died because God realized she was a failure, and you're going to be just like her if you don't learn to shut your mouth." Victoria's voice came out clear and sharp from the ballroom speakers. But it wasn't the Victoria at the altar. It was a cold, ruthless voice, full of venom. The ballroom fell into deadly silence. Some women put their hands to their chests. Men frowned. Alexander Harrison felt something break inside him. Samuel held the cell phone high, his small hands steady now. "This was last Tuesday," he explained in a clear voice, "when Dad went to Chicago on business." The recording continued. You could hear the sound of a door closing, high heels clicking on marble. "And another thing, you stupid boy. When your father and I get married, you're going to boarding school in Switzerland. Far away, because frankly you disgust me. You're just as pathetic as your mother was." A strangled cry came from someone's throat in the back tables. Alexander Harrison paled until he looked gray. Victoria tried to grab the cell phone. "That's edited. Those aren't my words." But Samuel dodged nimbly and continued playing. "You know why your dad never pays attention when you tell him things about me? Because I tell him you're a liar, that you make up stories for attention, and he believes me, not you, because I'm more important than you." The voice in the recording was clearly audible. It was unmistakable. Several guests began murmuring among themselves. Alexander Harrison slowly approached his son, as if walking in a dream. "Samuel," he murmured, "is this—" "It's real, Dad. Everything is real." The boy pressed the cell phone again. This time you could clearly hear the sound of a slap, followed by a child's crying. "I told you not to touch anything in my room. Are you deaf as well as stupid?" Sorry, Victoria, I don't want to hear your pathetic excuses. You're going to stay locked in your room until your father gets back. And if you say one word, I'll make sure they send you to an orphanage. Do you understand me?" The child's crying in the recording intensified. "Do you understand me?" "Yes. Yes. Victoria." The ballroom had erupted in murmurs. Some women were crying openly. Men looked at each other with expressions of disgust and shock. Victoria had backed up to the altar, her face decomposed. Her makeup was starting to run from tears she couldn't contain. "He's making all this up," she screamed, her voice no longer sweetly manufactured. "He's a troubled child. Everything he says is lies." But Samuel wasn't finished. With hands trembling slightly from adrenaline, he selected another recording. "This one is from a month ago," he announced. "The day you came back from the spa." Victoria's voice filled the space again, but this time she was talking on the phone. "Yes, Mom. Everything's almost ready. The prenup is signed. As soon as we're married, I'll have access to Harrison's accounts. And about the boy, I already spoke to the boarding school in Geneva. It's a very strict place. They'll keep him busy far from here." A pause. Then, "If I love him? Please, Mom. He's a whiny, pathetic brat. But it's the price I have to pay for Harrison's fortune. Once I send him away, Alexander will be so depressed he'll need me to make all the decisions. In 5 years, everything that's his will be mine." The impact was immediate. Shouts of indignation erupted throughout the ballroom. Chairs overturned as some guests stood up. An elderly woman, Samuel's aunt, put her hands to her mouth and began sobbing. Alexander Harrison staggered as if he had received a physical blow. "Victoria," his voice came out as a broken whisper. But Victoria was no longer pretending. Her mask had fallen completely. Her eyes gleamed with pure animal fury. "Yes!" she screamed, pointing at Samuel with a trembling finger. "Yes, it's all true. So what? That boy is an obstacle. His mother is dead, and he should be grateful someone wanted to be his new family." The screams of horror intensified. Alexander Harrison took a step toward his son, then another. Samuel looked him in the eyes for the first time in months. "Dad," he whispered, "there are more things you need to know." What else had Samuel recorded? What other secrets was the boy keeping who had learned to survive in silence? Samuel took a deep breath. For months he had dreamed of this moment. But now that it was here with 200 pairs of eyes fixed on him, he felt his legs trembling. Grace Williams approached discreetly and put a hand on his shoulder. That simple gesture gave him the strength he needed. "This recording is from 2 weeks ago," Samuel announced, his voice firmer now. "When Dad had to go to the hospital because he felt sick." He pressed play again. This time, the recording began with the sound of a door opening and Victoria's familiar footsteps entering Samuel's room. "Get up, brat. Your father is in the hospital and someone has to put order in this house." "Is my dad okay? Can I go see him?" "Your father is where he needs to be. And you're going to be where I say." You could hear the sound of something being dragged across the floor. "What are you doing, Victoria?" "Taking you where you belong, to the basement. Like dogs that don't know how to behave." "No, please, I'm afraid of the dark." "Well, you're going to get over that fear, or not. I don't care." The sound of a door closing with a lock. Then Samuel's heartbreaking crying. "Please, Victoria, I promise I'll behave. Don't leave me here." but there was no answer. Only the echo of the child's crying in the darkness. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Alexander Harrison had tears running down his cheeks. His son. His little son had been suffering, and he hadn't seen anything. "How long?" he murmured. 6 hours, Samuel replied, "until Grace came and found me." All eyes turned to Grace, whose eyes were red but maintained her composure. "I had an emergency key," she explained with a broken voice. "When I arrived and couldn't find Samuel, I searched the whole house. I found him in the basement, trembling, dehydrated." "And why didn't you tell me anything?" Alexander roared. "Because I told her that if she spoke, it would be worse for the boy," Victoria interrupted, her voice now loaded with pure venom. "And it worked, didn't it? Until now." The comment was like throwing gasoline on fire. Several men stood up, as if they were going to pounce on her. Women screamed insults, but Samuel raised his hand. "I'm not finished," he said. He selected another recording, this one more recent. This was yesterday, at night. The recording began with Victoria talking on the phone again, but her voice sounded different, more calculating. "Yes, doctor, you understand perfectly. After the wedding, we're going to need to evaluate the boy. He's been having episodes. Compulsive lying, aggressive behavior. His father is very worried." A pause. Of course, a specialized institution would be best. Something discreet, away from New York. Traumatized children need intensive treatment. Alexander Harrison felt his blood freeze. "Were you going to—" "I was going to get him the help he needs," Victoria screamed. "That boy isn't well. Anyone can see he has problems." "The only problem here is you." The voice shouting came from the back of the ballroom. It was Richard Morrison, Alexander's oldest partner. "Alexander, this woman was going to commit your son to a mental institution." Murmurs of horror ran through the tables. Samuel saw his father approach slowly, eyes shining with a mixture of pain and fury he had never seen before. "Samuel," Alexander murmured, kneeling in front of his son, "why didn't you tell me any of this before?" The boy looked at him with those eyes that were too big, too sad for his age. "Because every time I tried to tell you something about Victoria, you told me I was being difficult, that I had to give her a chance, that she loved me." The words fell like stones in still water. "And I believed her when she said I was a liar. I thought maybe I was crazy. Maybe I was a bad boy like she said." "My God," Alexander whispered. Samuel pressed play one last time. This is the recording from this morning, when everyone was getting ready for the wedding. Victoria's voice came out clear and cold. "Well, brat, this is your last day. Tomorrow your father and I will be on our honeymoon, and when we return, you'll already be at your new school in Switzerland. A place where problem children learn to shut their mouths forever. Victoria, please. You know what's the funniest part? Your father thinks this was my idea to help you. He doesn't know that, actually. You're never coming home. You'll never see your precious Grace again. And in a few years, when your father is completely under my control, maybe I'll tell him about a very sad accident that happened to his little boy at school." The ballroom exploded. Screams, chairs flying, men standing with clenched fists. Someone shouted, "Call the police!" Women crying. Total chaos. But in the middle of all that noise, Alexander Harrison only had eyes for his son. Samuel looked at him with a mixture of hope and terror, as if he still couldn't believe that finally someone had heard the truth. "Dad," he whispered, "do you not have to marry her anymore?" What would Alexander Harrison do now that he knew the truth? Could he forgive himself for having failed his son so completely? Alexander Harrison stood looking at his son for what seemed like an eternity. 8 years old. Samuel was 8 years old, and had had to become a detective to protect himself from the woman his own father had brought into his home. The voices around him faded. The shouts of indignation, the women's sobs, the insults directed at Victoria. Everything became a distant murmur. Only Samuel existed, his son, the boy who had learned to walk in that house, who had spoken his first words in his arms, who had cried at night after Caroline's death, seeking comfort his father had been too blind to give. "Samuel," Alexander murmured, his voice broken. "My son." He knelt completely, getting to the boy's eye level. Samuel instinctively stepped back, as he had learned to do for months. That gesture, that small step backward, was what finished breaking Alexander's heart. "Are you afraid of me?" he whispered. Samuel didn't respond immediately. His small hands still clutched the cell phone as if it were his only protection. "I'm not afraid of you, Dad," he finally said. "I'm afraid you won't believe me. I'm afraid you'll think I'm bad for ruining your wedding." The tears Alexander had been holding back finally came out. He cried like he hadn't cried since Caroline's death. He cried for every time he had silenced Samuel with, "We'll talk later, son." He cried for every time he had chosen to believe Victoria's sweet version instead of his son's sad eyes. "You didn't ruin anything," he said, his voice trembling. "You saved me. You saved both of us." Behind him, Victoria had completely lost her composure. Her wedding dress looked ridiculous now, like a poorly fitted costume. "This is all a conspiracy!" she screamed, pointing at Samuel and Grace. "That nanny filled the boy's head with lies. Everything is made up." Alexander slowly stood up, but didn't remove his hand from Samuel's shoulder. "Made up?" His voice came out dangerously calm. "The recordings are made up, Victoria? They can fake anything nowadays. And the bruises?" Silence. Alexander addressed the guests, his voice now clear and strong. "Dr. Martinez, you're here. Please, examine my son." Dr. Martinez, the family doctor for years, approached with a grave face. Samuel shrank a little, but Grace approached and took his hand. "He's just going to check you, my boy, so everyone can see the truth." Carefully, the doctor examined Samuel's arms, then his back. His expression grew darker. "Alexander," he said in a low voice, but loud enough for several to hear. "There are marks, bruises in different stages of healing. This didn't happen just once." A roar of fury came from Alexander's chest. He turned toward Victoria with eyes that looked like fire. "How many times did you hurt him?" Victoria stepped back, but she had nowhere left to hide. "It was for his own good. That boy doesn't respect authority. I had to discipline him." "Discipline him!" Alexander's voice resonated throughout the ballroom. "He's an 8-year-old child." He approached her, and for a moment, Samuel was afraid his father was going to do something terrible. But instead, Alexander removed the wedding ring he had worn since that morning. "This wedding is canceled," he announced in a clear, strong voice. "Victoria Sterling, I want you out of my house, out of my life, and out of my son's life. Now." "You can't do this!" she screamed. "We have a contract. We signed papers." "The prenuptial agreement clearly specifies that it's void in case of child abuse." A voice from behind intervened. It was Attorney Harrison, Alexander's lawyer. He had been recording everything with his own phone. "Besides," he continued, "I have recorded enough evidence for legal proceedings. I suggest you leave now, before we call the authorities." Victoria looked around, searching for a friendly face, someone who would defend her. But she only found looks of contempt and disgust. "This won't end here!" she screamed, but her voice sounded hysterical now. "You don't know who I am! My family!" "Your family," Richard Morrison interrupted, "is going to find out what you tried to do to this boy. I assure you that after this, you won't get work even organizing birthday parties." Two waiters discreetly approached Victoria. They didn't touch her, but their message was clear. With a scream of frustration, Victoria took off her shoes and ran toward the exit, her wedding dress dragging across the marble floor. The door closed behind her with a definitive sound. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't tense or uncomfortable. It was the silence of justice, of relief, of truth, finally freed. Alexander turned toward Samuel, who was still standing in the same place, as if he couldn't believe it was all over. "Son," Alexander murmured, kneeling again. "Do you forgive me?" Samuel looked at him with those big eyes, now bright with tears that weren't from fear. "Forgive you for what, Dad? For not listening to you? For not seeing you? For not protecting you when you needed me most?" Samuel dropped the cell phone for the first time. He ran toward his father and threw himself into his arms. "I forgive you, Dad, but can we go home now?" Alexander lifted him in his arms, feeling how light he was, how small he really was. "Yes, son. Let's go home." The ballroom erupted in applause. It wasn't applause celebrating a wedding, but applause for a brave boy who had found his voice, and for a father who had finally learned to listen. How would life be for Samuel and Alexander after this revelation? Could they really heal the wounds that had been left open for so long? 6 months later, the Harrison house looked completely different. Not because they had changed the furniture or renovated the decoration. It looked different because it finally felt like a home. Samuel ran through the marble hallways without fear of making noise. His laughter bounced off the high walls, filling spaces that had once been charged with tension and silence. Alexander had made drastic changes in his life. He had delegated much of his work to trusted partners, establishing a strict schedule, no office after 5 in the afternoon. Weekends were sacred, dedicated exclusively to Samuel. The first weeks had been difficult. Samuel took a long time to trust completely again. There were nights when he woke up screaming, nightmares where Victoria returned to look for him. There were days when he stayed quiet for hours, as if he had returned to those months of silent survival. But with patience, family therapy, and lots of love, the wounds began to heal. Dr. Martinez had recommended a psychologist specialized in childhood trauma, Dr. Patricia Sanchez. The sessions had been a slow but effective process. Samuel learned to be invisible to protect himself, the doctor had explained to Alexander. Now he needs to learn again that it's safe to be seen, heard, loved. And little by little, Samuel began to reappear. He returned to asking constant questions during dinner. He returned to asking for bedtime stories. He returned to hugging his father without tensing first. Grace had stayed, of course, not just as a nanny, but as part of the family. Alexander had given her a considerable raise, and, more importantly, had given her the recognition she deserved. "You saved my son when I couldn't," he had told her. "This house is your house for as long as you want." One April afternoon, Samuel was in the garden playing with Toby, a golden retriever they had adopted the week before. Alexander watched him from his study window, marveling at seeing his son behave like what he was, a normal 8-year-old boy. The cell phone that had been Samuel's secret weapon was now just that, a toy. He used it to take photos of Toby, to play simple video games, to make silly videos he sent to his aunt. He no longer needed to collect evidence to protect himself. He finally had a safety net formed by people who truly loved him. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. "How close I came to losing him," Alexander replied. "If he hadn't had the courage to speak." "But he did. And you had the courage to listen." Alexander nodded, but something in his expression worried Grace. "What happened? Is there news about Victoria?" "Attorney Harrison called me this morning. They're going to prosecute her for child abuse and attempted fraud. Samuel's recordings are sufficient evidence." "That's good, isn't it?" "Yes, but—" Alexander sighed. "They also discovered she did the same thing with 2 other children in previous families. She worked as a nanny before meeting me. Always the same pattern. Rich families, widowed or divorced fathers, vulnerable children." Grace put her hand to her chest. My God. And those children? The cases were already closed. The children were sent to institutions. Their fathers never knew the truth. The weight of that reality enveloped them. Samuel hadn't been Victoria's first victim, but thanks to his courage, he would be the last. "At least now she can't hurt anyone else," Grace murmured. In the garden, Samuel had managed to teach Toby to fetch a ball. His shouts of joy reached the window. "Dad, look what Toby did!" Alexander smiled and went out to the garden. He sat on the grass next to his son, not caring that his $1,000 suit got dirty. "You know what, Samuel?" "What, Dad?" "I'm proud of you." Samuel stopped playing with the ball and looked at his father. "Why?" "Because you were braver than I've been in my entire life. Because you did the right thing even though it was the hardest thing in the world." Samuel considered this seriously, as he now did with all important things. "Dad?" "Yes?" "Can we talk about Mom tonight?" For months after Caroline's death, mentioning his mother had been forbidden in that house. It was too painful for Alexander, and Samuel had learned to keep his memories like secret treasures. Now, talking about Caroline had become something beautiful again. "Of course we can talk about Mom," Alexander replied, ruffling Samuel's hair. "What do you want to know?" "I want you to tell me about when I was a baby and she sang to me. And I want to teach you the song I remember." Alexander felt his eyes fill with tears, but they were good tears. "I'd love to hear you sing, son." That night, after the three of them had dinner together, Alexander, Samuel, and Grace, as they had done every night for the past months, they sat in the living room. Samuel sang in his little voice the lullaby Caroline used to sing to him. He didn't remember it perfectly, and he made up some parts, but Alexander recognized the melody. It was "You Are My Sunshine," but Caroline had adapted it especially for Samuel. When he finished, Samuel curled up against his father. "Do you think Mom would have been proud of me for being brave?" "Son," Alexander murmured, "your mom would have been prouder of you than words could express. And she would have been proud that I finally learned to be the dad you need." Samuel was thoughtful for a moment. "Dad?" "Yes? Are we not going to have any more weddings at big altars?" Alexander laughed, a genuine laugh that hadn't come from him in years. "You know what? I think for a good while our perfect family is you, me, Grace, and Toby. Does that sound good to you?" Samuel nodded vigorously. "It sounds perfect to me." The garden of the Harrison house was decorated with wild flowers and simple hanging lights. There were no expensive orchids or pretentious arrangements, just daisies, sunflowers, and roses from Grace's garden. Samuel, now 10 years old, ran between the tables checking that everything was perfect. He had insisted on organizing this celebration himself. "Did the cake arrive yet?" he asked, his voice full of excitement. "It's already in the kitchen," Grace replied, wearing a simple but elegant blue dress. She had a smile that hadn't faded in weeks. It was Grace and Michael's wedding day, the gardener who had worked for the family for 15 years and who, slowly, had won the heart of the woman who had saved Samuel. It wasn't going to be a big ceremony. Just 30 guests, the people who really mattered. No marble altars or designer dresses, no rushing or rigid protocols. Alexander watched everything from the terrace, feeling a deep peace. In 2 years, his life had been completely transformed. His relationship with Samuel was solid, built on real trust and constant communication. His business continued to be successful, but now he had balance, and most importantly, he had learned to recognize what really had value. "Nervous?" Samuel asked, approaching his father. "Me? Why would I be nervous?" "Because Grace is getting married and she won't live here all the time anymore." It was a valid concern. For 2 years, Grace had been the stable pillar of their new family life. "You know what Grace told me yesterday?" Alexander asked. Samuel shook his head. "She told me that she and Michael are going to live in the little house in the garden, that this is still her family, and nothing will change that." Samuel smiled with relief. "Besides," Alexander continued, "you and I have learned to take very good care of ourselves, don't you think?" It was true. Samuel now cooked simple breakfasts on Saturdays. Alexander had learned to braid hair for when Samuel decided he wanted long hair like his mom. They had created their own routines, new traditions. The ceremony was perfect in its simplicity. Michael, in his borrowed suit, but with his genuine smile, waited under the flower arch that Samuel had helped make. When Grace walked toward him, there was no violin music. Samuel played his harmonica, a melody he had learned especially for the occasion. The priest who married them was Father Matthews, the same one who had worked at the orphanage where Grace had grown up. His ceremony was brief, warm, full of words about love that grows slowly and family that is chosen. When it came time for the rings, Samuel approached with a huge smile. He carried the rings on a small pillow he had embroidered himself. "Grace," he said in a clear voice, "thank you for teaching me that families are built with love, not fear." Everyone present got teary-eyed. After the ceremony, while the guests ate homemade cake and laughed with simple stories, Samuel approached his father. "Dad?" "Yes, son? Do you remember what you said the day of your wedding with Victoria?" Alexander tensed slightly. They rarely talked about that day, although he knew it was important not to pretend it had never happened. "What did I say?" "You said families are built with promises, but I think you were wrong." Alexander looked at him curiously. "Oh, really? And how are families built?" Samuel pointed around them, at Grace dancing with Michael, at Toby running among the invited children, at the true friends who had remained after knowing the truth. They're built with every day, with listening to each other, with choosing each other again every morning. Alexander felt his heart fill with pride. His 10-year-old son had learned in 2 years what it had taken him 45 to understand. "You're right, son. Completely right." Samuel nodded satisfied, then ran to play with the other children. Alexander stood watching the scene, remembering another day, 2 years ago, when everything had changed in a luxurious ballroom. Samuel had found his voice that day, but more importantly, he had taught his father to find his. Now, as he watched his son laugh without fear, Alexander knew they had built something real, something no lie could destroy, because it was made of truth, patience, and everyday love. In his pocket, his phone vibrated. It was a text message from Samuel, sent from across the garden. "Thanks for choosing me every day, Dad. I choose you too." Alexander smiled, put away the phone, and went to play with his son. Because he had learned that important moments don't always happen at marble altars or grand ceremonies. Sometimes the most important moments happen in simple gardens, with homemade flowers and children who have finally learned it's safe to be happy. This story reminds us of something fundamental. Children have a voice, and it's our responsibility as adults to listen to it. Samuel didn't need to be rescued by an adult. He himself found a way to save himself, but he needed someone to believe him. How many children like Samuel are still waiting to be heard? How many times do we assume adults are always right without questioning power dynamics that might be hurting the most vulnerable? Truth, when spoken with courage, can change everything. But for that truth to come to light, we need to create safe spaces where children know they will be believed, protected, and loved. Maybe you can make the difference. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and share it. Tell us what country you're watching from, and remember, truth, when spoken with courage, can change everything. In the comments, share if you were ever witness to a situation where a child needed to be heard. Your story could inspire someone else to speak or to listen, because in the end, we all have the responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And sometimes that protection begins simply with believing.